The spaceport of Vethera Dock smelled like burnt metal and old grease. It always did. Every wall was stained with the smoke of 10,000 cheap engine burns, and every corner held something or someone that did not want to be looked at too closely. Traders argued in 6 different languages at once. Cargo lifters rumbled across the floor. Somewhere, a creature was screaming about a missing shipment, and nobody was paying attention. Valith Oren moved through the crowd with her head low and her eyes open. She was Sirathi lean, scaled in pale silver, with narrow yellow eyes that missed very little. She was young for an intelligence analyst, only 30 cycles old, but she had already earned a reputation for being precise, cold, and difficult to fool. Her superiors in the Keth Dominion liked that about her. They had sent her to Vethera Dock to find a weapons manifest, a stolen document that contained the supply routes of a black market arms network that had been bleeding weapons into unstable systems for the better part of 2 years. It was supposed to be a simple retrieval job. Come in, meet the contact, take the file, leave. She found a table near the back of the main bar, ordered something that smelled less terrible than everything else on the menu, and waited. The bar was loud. Most places in Vethera Dock were loud. But Valith noticed, as she sat and listened, that the noise had a different quality tonight. It was the kind of noise that covered something else underneath it, a nervousness, a held breath. Groups of aliens leaned close to each other and spoke in low voices. A pair of Drenari merchants at the next table kept glancing toward the entrance. A Vorath trader, 3 seats down, had not touched his drink in 20 minutes. Valith picked up fragments of conversation. Been in the outer reaches for weeks. They say, whole network, just gone. Not raided, not arrested. Just time's gone. I heard it was a human. She paused. She listened harder. The word moved through the bar like a slow fire. Human. The conversations were all different, but they were all circling the same center. Something had happened out in the outer reaches. Something quiet and complete, and deeply unsettling. And a human was involved. Valith was not particularly afraid of humans. She had read the standard Dominion intelligence briefings on them, a young species, barely 2 centuries into space travel, physically average by galactic standards, no special biological advantages, no ancient empire behind them. They were curious, and sometimes reckless, and occasionally very clever. But afraid of them? That seemed like an overreaction. The name she kept hearing was Ashen. Not a real name, she quickly understood. Nobody seemed to agree on whether it was a title or a call sign, or simply the word that had attached itself to one particular human, the way bad smells attach to certain docking bays. She heard it from the Drenari merchants, who said it with the careful tone of people who did not want to say it too loudly. She heard it from a large Keth trader across the room, who had lowered his voice to almost nothing. She heard it from a young Sirathi dock worker, who told his companion that 3 different smuggling operations in the Reach had collapsed in the last 6 months. And every time, the only trace was a single human seen somewhere nearby in the days before. The stories did not agree on anything, except the fear. One account said Ashen was enormous, broad-shouldered, intimidating to look at. Another said he was small and unremarkable, the kind of face you forgot the moment you stopped looking at it. One story had him walking into a warlord's compound alone and walking back out 2 hours later while the entire operation fell apart behind him. Another described him as someone who never went near the dangerous places at all, just gathered information quietly until the whole structure collapsed on itself. Valith filed it away in the analytical part of her brain, marked time's mythology and exaggeration. Every species in the galaxy had its ghost stories. Humans apparently had one too, and they had apparently given it a name and a reputation that had no consistent shape. That was what legends were, stories that grew in the dark, because nobody had bothered to turn on a light. She checked the time. Her contact was late. She ordered a second drink and watched the door. A Drenari family moved through the crowd near the entrance. Mother, father, 3 small children. One of the children, a tiny female barely old enough to walk steadily, separated from the group in the press of bodies, and stood in the middle of the floor looking lost. The crowd moved around her without stopping. The child's large, dark eyes searched in every direction for a familiar face, and found none. Valith had stood halfway out of her seat, before she realized she didn't need to. Someone else was already there. A human crouched down in front of the child. He was average in height, a little lean, wearing a jacket that had clearly survived better days. He said something to the child in a quiet voice. The child looked at him for a moment, then pointed across the bar. The human nodded, took the child's hand gently, and walked her carefully through the crowd until she reached her mother, who grabbed her with a grip born entirely from relief. The human exchanged a few words with the mother, nodded once, and turned back toward the bar. He sat down 2 seats away from where Valeth had been watching. He had a plain face, brown skin, dark eyes, short hair with a little gray at the edges. He looked tired in the way that went deeper than sleep could fix. He ordered a drink, something warm, by the look of the steam, and sat quietly with both hands around the cup, looking at nothing in particular. Valeth looked away. Her contact arrived 5 minutes later, sliding into the seat across from her with the skittish energy of someone who had been running. He was a small Keth male, with quick hands and bad teeth, and he pushed a data chip across the table to her the moment he sat down. "The manifest," he said. "All of it. Routes, names, transaction records, going back 18 months. That's everything you asked for." "Good," Valeth said. "What's the condition?" "No condition. I just want this done." He was not looking at her. His eyes kept moving around the bar in small, rapid movements, like an animal checking for predators. "I want to be done with this whole thing, and I want to go somewhere quiet, and I want—" He stopped. His eyes had landed on something behind her. His face changed completely. The blood left it, or whatever the Keth equivalent of blood leaving was, and the skittish energy became something still and rigid. Then he stood up without another word, without picking up his payment, without looking at her again, and walked quickly toward the exit, and was gone. Valeth sat for 1 full second. Then she turned around. The human at the bar was still sitting quietly with his warm drink. He had not moved. He had not looked at her contact. He was watching the steam rise from his cup, but he felt her looking, because he raised his eyes and found hers across the short distance between them. He gave her a small, polite nod, the kind a stranger gives when they have accidentally made eye contact. Then he looked back at his drink. Valeth sat very still. She turned the data chip over once in her fingers, and she began, for the first time, to think that maybe the stories were not entirely mythology after all. Valeth did not sleep well that night. She was back on her ship, a small and functional Sirathi courier vessel, docked in Bay 17 of Vethera Dock. The data chip her contact had given her sat on the desk in front of her, already copied to her secure system and encrypted. She had done the work quickly and professionally, as she always did. The manifest was genuine, she could see that much from a surface scan. Names, routes, transaction records, exactly as promised. She would send it to her superiors in the morning. She should have gone to sleep after that. Instead, she opened her intelligence terminal and started searching for a human male with no travel record. The ship's biometric scanner had flagged his DNA signature when she had passed close enough in the bar. It was a passive scan, illegal by some standards, standard practice by others, and common enough in Dominion field operations that nobody thought twice about it. The scan had returned a result. The result was almost nothing. There was no name attached to the biometric signature in any Keth Dominion database. No travel clearance, no registered ship, no trade license, no flag of any kind. He existed in the system as a single biological entry times. Human male, adult, approximate age, 38 to 45. Unregistered times, and nothing else. As if someone had taken a real person and very carefully removed every piece of paper that proved he was there. Valeth had found gaps in records before, but they were usually messy. Deleted files left traces. Empty fields had timestamps. This was different. This was clean in the way that only someone with either very powerful friends or very specific skills could manage. She pulled up the Dominion's classified intelligence files on humanity. She had read the standard briefings before. They described humans as a young species, ambitious but limited, useful for trade partnerships, and occasionally disruptive in border regions. The standard briefings were written for junior officers who needed a quick overview. She had read them at the academy, and never thought much about them since. The classified files were different. They had been compiled over 40 years by Keth intelligence analysts, and they were written with the careful, slightly uncomfortable tone of people who were trying to be objective about something that made them uneasy. Valith read slowly, sitting in the cold blue light of her terminal, with the rest of the ship dark and quiet around her. Humanity had reached space 211 years ago. In that time, they had not built a large empire. They had not launched any major wars of conquest. They had no ancient history of galactic dominance, no legendary military tradition, no superweapon that other species feared. By almost every standard measure of power that the Keth Dominion used, they were a mid-tier young species, still finding their place in a very large galaxy. And yet, 3 interstellar conflicts in the last century had ended in ways that analysts still struggled to explain cleanly. In each case, the end had come not from a decisive military campaign, but from a collapse internal, sudden, and difficult to trace. Trade alliances had broken. Key figures had changed sides or disappeared. Supply chains that should have been secure were found to be completely compromised. In each case, human operatives had been present in the relevant regions in the years preceding the collapse. Not armies, not fleets, people. One person, in the case of the Harrow conflicts. One person embedded in a region for 2 years, moving quietly, building no visible power base, drawing no attention until the entire structure of a 12-system weapons cartel fell apart in the space of 3 months. The Keth High Council's private assessment was attached to the file as a supplementary document. Valith read the relevant section twice. It said, "Humanity does not appear to conquer by force. It corrodes. Individual humans, placed in critical positions and given sufficient time, have demonstrated a capacity to dismantle complex structures that took decades to build. The mechanism is not fully understood. It appears to involve a combination of social adaptability, extreme tolerance for risk, and a particular quality of patience that our analysts have struggled to categorize. They do not seem to give up. This is not merely a behavioral observation. It appears to be something more fundamental." Valith leaned back in her chair. She searched specifically for Ashen Next. The file was not large, but it was dense. 17 verified incidents over 12 years, across 9 different star systems. A slave trading operation in the Drevos Belt dismantled. A weapons manufacturing network supplying 3 different conflict zones gone. A planetary governor who had ordered the massacre of a refugee colony on the moon of Sereth 4 found dead under circumstances that no investigation had satisfactorily explained. With his entire security apparatus having fallen apart in the preceding weeks, a child trafficking ring operating across 4 systems collapsed overnight, with every record destroyed and every victim recovered. No army, no fleet, no organization with a name or a flag. One human, moving, working, patient. The file contained no confirmed photograph. The physical descriptions collected from witnesses ranged so widely that they were nearly useless. Tall, short, heavy, lean, dark, pale, loud, silent. The only consistent element across all 17 accounts was a sense, reported by witnesses from 7 different species, of a particular quality in his presence. The closest translation from the Keth original was something like times weight, times the feeling of being in the same space as something that had seen more than you had and was not frightened by any of it. Valith sat with that for a while. She thought about the bar, about the way her contact's face had gone still and bloodless when he looked over her shoulder, about a human with a plain face, sitting quietly with a warm drink, watching the steam rise, apparently undisturbed by the entire nervous galaxy moving around him. She thought about the little Drenari child, clinging to his arm and laughing. She tried to match that image against the file on her screen and found that both things were true at the same time, and that somehow, the combination was more unsettling than either one alone. It was nearly the 3rd hour of the ship's night cycle before she finally closed the terminal. She lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. She had been trained to analyze threats. She had been taught to assess danger in measurable terms: weapons, numbers, capability, intent. She had always been good at it because she was precise, and she did not let emotion interfere with her measurements. The human in the bar did not fit any of her measurements. He was not threatening to look at. He had no visible weapons. He had helped a lost child find her mother. He had sat quietly and drunk his warm drink, and bothered nobody. And yet the most reliable Keth intelligence assessment in 40 years described his kind as something that corroded. That did not give up. That could walk into a dark place and take it apart from the inside with nothing but time and patience and an apparently complete lack of self-preservation. She fell asleep eventually. She dreamed of a trail of collapsed structures spreading across a star map, and a single, unhurried set of footprints running through the middle of all of it. In the morning, she went back to the bar. He was already there. Same table, same warm drink. He looked up when she walked in, and there was nothing surprised in his expression. He had known she would come back. He didn't say that. He didn't need to. "You've been reading about me," he said. His voice was calm and a little rough, like gravel that had been smoothed by a long time in water. "You have questions. Ask them." He nodded at the seat across from him. "I'm not going anywhere tonight." Valith sat down. She put both hands flat on the table, a Sarathi gesture that meant times. "I am not here to deceive you. Times." And she looked at him directly for the first time without pretending she wasn't. He looked back at her with those dark, tired eyes and waited, without any impatience at all, for her to begin. The bar had emptied out in the slow, gradual way that bars do when the night cycle ends and the work cycle begins. A few drinkers remained in the far corners, nursing whatever they had left. The noise had dropped to something almost manageable. Outside the dirty windows, the dock lights had shifted from their harsh white to the dimmer gold of morning operations, and the sound of cargo loaders had replaced the sound of arguments. Valith sat across from the human and tried to decide where to start. She started at the obvious place. "Are you Ashen?" He looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "That's what people call the work, I think. Not really me." He paused. "But yes." He said it without any pride, without any performance. He said it the way someone admits to a job title they have stopped thinking much about. His name, he told her, was Callum Voss. He said it like it was a small and unremarkable fact, which she suspected was the point. He spoke her language, standard Sarathi, not the trade dialect, the actual language without an accent. When she reacted to that, he mentioned casually that he also spoke 3 other Sarathi regional variations and had been studying a 4th before things got busy. He said this without showing off. He was simply explaining. She asked how he had started doing this. He was quiet for a moment. Then he talked. Not with drama, not with the energy of someone performing their own story, but with the measured pace of someone who had thought about something for a long time and arrived at a version they could say out loud without it breaking them. He had been a humanitarian liaison, originally, a representative for a human organization that monitored civilian welfare in contested systems. His job had been to file reports, attend meetings, submit documentation, and advocate through official channels for people who were being hurt. He had done that job for 6 years. He had filed many reports. He had attended many meetings. He had watched, very carefully and very closely, as the official channels moved slowly enough that the people he was documenting had usually been moved, sold, or killed by the time any formal response arrived. "I'm not against institutions," he said. He turned his cup slowly in his hands. "I understand why they exist. Rules and structures and processes, those things protect people too, most of the time. But there are places where the structure doesn't reach, or where the structure has been bought, and in those places, waiting for the right form to be filed is its own kind of decision. It's deciding that the process matters more than the people." He had made a different decision. Valith studied him while he talked. She was good at reading people, it was most of her job, and she kept looking for the seams. Every person who told a story about themselves was also constructing something, shaping it, making it easier to look at. She looked for the places where the shape didn't match the underlying structure. She found very few. He was not performing heroism. If anything, he was doing the opposite, deflating it wherever it tried to rise. When she asked about a specific incident she had read in the file, a slave operation in the Drevos belt that had freed over 300 people. He talked about it in terms of logistics and errors and things that had almost gone wrong, and mentioned the people freed only once, at the end, as the point of the whole thing. Not the exciting part. The point. She pushed harder. That was her job. She looked for lies. She asked about the planetary governor, the one who had ordered the massacre on Serath 4 and was later found dead. Callum was quiet for longer this time. He made a choice, he said finally. I gave him an opportunity to make a different one. He didn't take it. That's not an answer, Valeth said. No, he agreed. It isn't. He met her eyes. Some things I don't explain. Not because I'm hiding them. Because explaining them turns them into a story, and I don't want them to be a story. I want them to stay as heavy as they actually are. She believed him. That was the unsettling part. She had been trained not to simply believe people, to test and probe and find the fault lines. But there was something about the way Callum Voss spoke that had no fault lines. Not because he was hiding them, but because he genuinely did not have an ego that needed protecting. He had no version of himself that he was trying to sell her. Most people, she had found in her work, were afraid of being seen clearly. They constructed stories that put them at the center, in the most favorable light. Callum talked about himself as if he were a variable in a larger equation present, relevant, but not the point. That quality, she realized, was the thing that none of the stories had managed to capture. The thing that made the galaxy's whispers always feel slightly wrong. They described him as powerful, or terrifying, or unstoppable. And all of those things missed the actual quality entirely. The actual quality was that he did not stop. Not because he was fearless, not because he was some superior kind of being, but because stopping had become something he simply could not justify to himself. He had stood in too many dark places and seen too many specific faces to be able to turn around and walk back toward the light and pretend the dark wasn't there. He spoke about his crew briefly, without being asked the Drenari medic he'd been working with for 4 years, the Keth engineer who had left the Dominion service after seeing things he couldn't unsee, the Vorath scout who barely spoke but whose instincts had saved their lives more than once. He described them with an affection that was quiet and unadorned, the kind that comes from having been through real things with real people. Then he said, without any shift in tone, "The weapons manifest you picked up last night. You know it's only part of something bigger." Valeth went still. "The network that produced it isn't a typical black market operation," he continued. "It's a coordinated rearmament. A Keth splinter faction, 3 systems over, has been buying hardware for the better part of a year. They're almost ready. The target is a civilian system. 30 million people, minimum. How do you know this? Because I've been following the same trail you have, he said, for longer. She stared at him. And you came here? To this specific port? At this specific time? He looked at her calmly. You're a Sarathi intelligence analyst operating without a field team in a sector your own Dominion considers low priority. You're good at your job. You found the manifest in 3 days when it took my contact 2 weeks. I thought you might be useful. A small pause. I thought you might want to be. He reached into his jacket and placed a data chip on the table between them. It was older than hers, scratched from use, but clearly well maintained. Everything I have, he said. Locations, personnel, timeline. There's a staging point. An old industrial station in the deep black, 2 days travel. We move before they're ready, or 30 million people have a very bad month. He slid the chip across the table with one finger. I could use a Sarathi analyst who isn't afraid to look at ugly things, he said. But that's your choice. He stood, picking up his cup. You know where I'll be. He walked toward the window and stood there, watching the dock outside with that same patient stillness, giving her the space to think. Valeth looked at the chip on the table. She thought about 300 freed people in the Drevos belt. She thought about a Keth intelligence assessment that used the word times corrodes. She thought about 30 million people in a civilian system who did not know that someone was counting their days. She picked up the chip. The station had no name in any current registry. It appeared on old Keth survey maps as Industrial Platform Voris, 7, decommissioned 30 years ago following a catastrophic coolant failure that had killed its crew and left the structure drifting in a slow, lonely orbit around a brown dwarf that nobody visited. It was the kind of place that got forgotten on purpose, too far from the trade lanes to be worth salvaging, too structurally compromised to be worth repairing, but large enough to hide things in if you didn't mind the cold and the dark and the smell of old machinery that had burned and never been cleaned. The Splinter faction had been using it for 7 months. Callum's ship was small, fast, and almost entirely undetectable by standard Keth sensor arrays. It was not glamorous. The interior was clean in a functional way, and every surface had been used until it wore smooth. Valeth had expected something more impressive, and then felt slightly foolish for having expected it at all. The crew was exactly as he had described them. Senna, the Drennery medic, was small and quick-moving, and had the kind of eyes that took in everything and gave away very little. She greeted Valeth with a short nod and immediately went back to checking her medical kit with the focus of someone who had learned not to be underprepared. Dorvac, the Keth engineer, was large and quiet, and looked at Valeth with the particular complicated expression of a Keth citizen looking at a Keth Dominion operative, not hostile, but not easy either. Ren, the Vorath scout, did not acknowledge her arrival at all, which Callum told her quietly was the equivalent of a warm welcome. They spent the travel time planning. Callum ran through the station layout on a projected map, entry points, patrol patterns, the location of the weapons stockpile, the command center on the upper level where the faction's leadership would be operating. He talked through the plan methodically, checked assumptions with each member of the crew, adjusted when they pushed back, and moved forward without wasted time. He did not give a speech. He did not try to make anyone feel brave. He simply made sure everyone knew what they were doing and why. Valeth contributed what she knew. Her read of the manifest had given her detail on supply schedules and personnel rotations that Callum had not had. He listened to her with complete attention, updated the plan twice, and thanked her without making it sound like he was surprised she was useful. They entered the station through a maintenance shaft on the station's lower ring, in a section the patrol rotation left unwatched for 11-minute windows. Ren went first, then Callum, then Valeth, then Dorvac. Senna came last, her kit sealed and silent against her back. For 40 minutes, it went exactly as planned. Then a security sweep that had not been on any schedule moved through the central corridor ahead of them, and everything changed. They pressed back into a side passage. 6 armed guards, Keth, moving in a careful pattern that covered 3 of their 4 exit routes simultaneously. The shift had been moved either by bad luck or by someone who was more careful than expected. Valeth ran the angles in her head and did not like any of them. Ren found the 4th exit route, a maintenance crawl space that would bring them out behind the patrol's position, but the passage was narrow and low and would take time, and the patrol would turn before they were through. Callum told Dorvac and Valeth to move through the crawl space. He looked at Ren, and something passed between them that was not quite a conversation. Then he stepped out of the side passage and walked, openly, into the corridor. The patrol stopped. Every weapon came up. Callum raised both hands slowly and spoke to them in standard Keth, calm and clear and completely without panic. He told them he was lost, that he had come aboard seeking shelter from a navigation failure, that he meant no harm. He spoke with the unhurried ease of someone who had done this before, and he kept all 6 of them focused entirely on him while the others moved. Valeth watched through the narrow gap of the side passage long enough to understand what he was doing, and then she moved. The crawl space was miserable. It was dark and too small even for her lean frame and smelled of decades of machine oil and dead air. She moved through it faster than was comfortable, following Dorvac's broad shoulders ahead of her, trying not to think about what Callum was doing in the corridor behind them. They came out on the other side. Ren was already there. 10 seconds later, Callum arrived from a different angle, having talked his way through the patrol with a story about a disabled cargo shuttle that she suspected he had invented on the spot. There was a small cut above his ear. He had clearly been grabbed at some point. He did not mention it. Senna was not with them. They found her 20 meters back, pinned behind a collapsed section of ceiling strut that had given way under the weight of old damage. She was conscious, her leg caught, her face controlled in the way of someone managing real pain without showing all of it. The injury was not fatal, but it was bad, and moving her would take time they did not have, and make noise they could not afford. Senna looked at Callum and said, very quietly, "Go. I know where the exits are." Callum crouched down in front of her. He did not look like someone who was considering leaving. He looked at the strut, at the ceiling above it, at the angles of the fall. Then he looked at Dorvac. "Tell me the first step," he said. Dorvac started to say it was impossible. Callum waited. Dorvac said, "The load is distributed across 2 contact points. First step," Callum said again. "Patient, without pressure." Dorvac breathed out. "I'd need to create a counterweight on the far side. What do you need for that?" They worked through it, step by step, with Callum asking the next question every time Dorvac stopped. Not because he knew the answers, but because he knew that Dorvac did, and that what Dorvac needed was not an engineer but someone who refused to accept that they had run out of steps. 7 minutes later, with Ren's weight as the counterweight and Valeth holding a brace that should not have held, the strut shifted, and Senna pulled herself free. She could not walk properly. Dorvac carried her. They were behind schedule. The window for the command center was closing. Callum did not change his pace. He moved toward the upper level with the same steadiness he had moved with since the station, and Valeth stayed close behind him and tried to match it. The command center had 12 people in it. Callum walked in alone. He was unarmed, visibly. He walked in through the main door, with his hands open at his sides, and stood in the center of the room, while 12 people raised weapons at him from every direction. The faction's commander, a Keth officer, with the particular posture of someone accustomed to being obeyed, stood at the center console and looked at the human in his command room with a combination of fury and something else that Valeth, watching through the corridor's secondary access panel, recognized as unease. Callum said his name. Not Callum Voss. The other name. The room changed. It did not become peaceful, but it became still in a way that had not been there before. Several of the weapons did not lower, but the hands holding them became slightly less certain. The commander's posture shifted. Even the most prepared person has a moment of hesitation when the name they have only heard in dark and nervous places walks into the room and says it belongs to the face in front of them. Callum spoke for 4 minutes. He did not shout. He told them exactly what the outcomes were, not as threats, but as logical progressions. He described the 30 million people in the civilian system with a specificity and a steadiness that made it impossible to treat them as an abstraction. He described what would happen after, and after that, with the precision of someone who had seen enough endings to map them clearly. 3 of the 12 laid down their weapons before he finished. Then 2 more. It was not all of them. It was not easy, and it was not clean, and what happened next was difficult and costly in ways that Valeth would carry for a long time. But the center held. The operation fell apart. The stockpile was destroyed. The leadership was detained. When it was over, Valeth found Callum sitting on the floor of the command center's outer corridor, back against the wall, attending to a wound on his side with the focused calm of someone doing necessary maintenance. The jacket was ruined. He looked exhausted in a way that went past the physical. She sat down beside him. The station was quiet now, except for the low hum of old machinery and the distant sound of Senna directing medical attention with considerable authority, despite her own injury. After a long silence, Callum said it quietly, almost to himself. 17 made it out this time. Valeth did not ask what he meant. She knew. She had read the file. She understood what he counted, and why he counted it, and what it cost him to keep doing it. She sat beside him in the dark corridor of a forgotten station, and said nothing, and the silence between them was the kind that did not need to be filled. The report took Valeth 3 hours to write. She sat in her ship, which was docked at a different port, now a cleaner one, further from the outer reaches, with better lighting and fewer people who looked like they were hiding something. The sound outside her window was the ordinary sound of trade and movement, and the small daily business of 100 different species going about their lives. And it felt very different from the sounds she had been listening to for the past week. She wrote carefully. She described the Keth splinter faction, the weapons stockpile, the staging station, the operation. She documented the intelligence trail from the manifest her contact had given her, to the final confirmation, at Platform Vorus 7. She described the personnel involved in the faction's leadership and the nature of the threat to the civilian system and the steps taken to neutralize it. She listed the outcome: threat eliminated, weapons destroyed, key figures detained, and ready for Dominion processing. She did not include a name for the human operative who had been present. She filed him under Time's unaffiliated asset, human, details withheld per field security protocol. It was a real protocol. She had never used it before. She used it now without feeling any particular need to examine why. Her superior contacted her 2 hours after she submitted the report. He was a senior analyst named Corveth, older and very careful, who had the habit of saying very little and meaning more than he said. He read through her report on the call with an expression that did not change, and then asked her, in a tone that was perfectly level, to tell him more about the human operative. Valeth told him that the operative had been instrumental in identifying the staging location and had provided critical intelligence that she had not been able to obtain through official channels. She said that the operative had no Dominion affiliation and operated independently across multiple systems. She said that, in her professional assessment, pursuing the operative's identity further would be unlikely to serve any Dominion interest and might compromise future cooperation. Corveth looked at her for a moment. "And you're confident in that assessment?" "Yes," she said. He made a small sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement, and told her the report was satisfactory and that she had done good work. Then he ended the call. Valeth sat for a moment after the screen went dark. She was not certain when she had decided to protect Callum. She could not point to a specific moment. It had not felt like a decision so much as something that had simply become true at some point, the way a window becomes dirty gradually, and you only notice it when the light changes. She found him at the dock before he left. He was loading supplies onto his ship, which was as small and functional and quietly capable-looking as she had expected, with the same worn quality as everything else he owned. Senna was already aboard, her leg properly treated now, and her manner as focused and precise as ever. Dorvac was running a systems check. Ren was nowhere visible, which she had come to understand meant he was probably everywhere. Callum saw her approaching and stopped what he was doing and waited. She told him the report was filed. She told him he was not in it. He nodded once, slowly, without appearing surprised or particularly relieved. She asked him the question she had been carrying since the bar. "Why?" She kept her voice even. "You have no one ordering you to do this. No nation, no organization, no rank. Nobody is paying you. Nobody would blame you if you stopped." She paused. "Why do you keep going back in?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for an answer, but the quiet of someone deciding how much of an existing answer to say out loud. "There's a family in the Dravos belt," he said finally. "A mother and her 2 daughters. They were 3 years in a transit camp before I found them. They have a house now. The daughters go to school." He turned the supply crate in his hands once, not looking at her. "They don't know my name. They wouldn't recognize my face. They're just living." A pause. "That keeps happening. People keep living. Who would have stopped? Long after I'm done. Long after anyone remembers anything about any of this. They keep existing." He looked at her. "That's enough. That's actually enough." She could not find anything to say to that. He picked up the last crate and moved toward the ship's loading hatch. At the top of the ramp he stopped and turned back, and for a moment he looked at her with those dark, tired eyes that had seen too many dark corridors and chosen to keep walking through them anyway. "Take care of yourself," he said. "You're good at this work. Make sure it stays worth doing." Then he went inside, and the hatch closed, and the ship lifted and was gone inside of 4 minutes, slipping into the dock traffic with the quiet efficiency of something that had long ago learned not to be noticed. Valeth stood in the empty bay and watched the space where his ship had been. She went back to her work. The days moved. She filed other reports on other matters, met other contacts in other ports, did the careful and unglamorous work of intelligence analysis that kept the Dominion's machinery running. She was good at her job, as she had always been, and she did it with the same precision she had always brought to it. But something had shifted. in the way that things shift when you have seen something clearly that you used to only look at from the side. She read differently now. When intelligence reports crossed her desk describing collapsed networks or fallen operations in the outer reaches and beyond, she read them more carefully than she used to. She noticed the patterns, the particular shape of an operation that had been taken apart from the inside, quietly, over months, by someone who had not been in any hurry and had not needed anyone to know. She noticed the specific silence that came after no credit claimed, no name attached, just an absence where something harmful had been. She kept those observations to herself. 3 months later, she was in a market in a transit city near the Sarathi border. It was a bright, crowded place, full of color and noise, and the smell of food from a dozen different worlds. She was buying components for a secondary scanner, ordinary work, ordinary afternoon, when she heard 2 alien merchants at a nearby stall drop their voices and lean together in the way she had first noticed in Vethera Dock. She slowed down without stopping. They were talking about the Harrow sector. Something had happened there. A weapons lord who had controlled 6 systems and been considered untouchable had simply ceased to operate. Not a war, not a raid, just a slow and complete unraveling, over 4 months, until one day there was nothing left. The people who had been under that weapons lord's control were, by all accounts, still trying to understand that they were free. A human, the merchants said. It was a human, they were certain of it. The one they called Ashen. Unstoppable, unknowable. The galaxy's quiet terror. One of them said the name, and then looked around instinctively, as if saying it too clearly might cause something to happen. Valith stood still and listened. She heard them build the legend, the enormous shadow, the impossible reach, the supernatural patience. She heard them describe something vast and frightening, and beyond ordinary understanding. She thought of a man sitting on the floor of a broken corridor, carefully cleaning a wound, quietly counting the people who had made it out. She thought of warm steam rising from a cup, of a lost child, laughing, of a family in the Drevos belt whose daughters went to school. She thought of the thing he had said, "That's enough. That's actually enough." She said nothing. She picked up her components and paid for them, and walked back into the bright, crowded, ordinary street. She carried the knowledge quietly, the way she carried everything that mattered, not as a story to be told, but as a weight that reminded her what things actually were. The galaxy whispered his name in the dark corners, and the nervous places, and the hushed conversations of 100 species who did not know what they were afraid of. She knew. She had sat across from it in a bar with a dirty window and a warm drink, and asked it questions, and it had answered her honestly, without drama, without pride. And then it had gone back to work. They had the name completely right. They had the reason completely wrong. And somewhere in the dark, in whatever corridor he had walked into next, the count was still going.